journey, if you like, from being a freedom fighter to becoming a healer parallels the journey of South Africa.
Mercifully for us, Michael chose to abandon victimhood.
I think most of us who saw him in those first couple of hours didn't think that he would live.
I haven't forgiven anybody. I don't know what it means personally to forgive an abstraction.
Michael Lapsley was born to Laura and David Lapsley in Hastings, New Zealand. At the age of 17, he went to Australia to be trained by an Anglican religious community called the Society of the Sacred Mission.
On June the 29th, 1973, I was ordained as a priest within the Anglican Church.
His religious community sent him to South Africa to further his studies.
I remember the night that I was told that that was the intention, not sleeping, and somehow I did realize that this was going to be something momentous and life-changing. And I suppose in my naivety, I thought that when I arrived in South Africa, I was going to find three groups of people: the oppressed, the oppressor, and the human race that I would belong to.
Under the apartheid regime, it was democracy for only the white minority.
So the majority were voteless, which also meant that they had no peaceful way to be able to remove the state.
You couldn't walk freely in other places because it was written whites only.
There were two, what we call lifts or elevators, and one has on it whites only, the other has goods or non-whites. And for me, that's an image that stayed with me through the years, that somehow we who are white were people, and those who are not white were like objects about whom we decided.
It was a very kind of a painful life that we, were living, to see people being shot and killed.
Using today's figures, there are about 45 million people, of whom 5 million are white. Those 5 million people owned 87% of the land surface of South Africa, and so the majority of the nation was then forced into this 13%.
In South Africa, even the church was divided.
White Christians decided, and in particular places in South Africa, that they were not willing to sit at the table of the Lord with black Christians.
The church itself became a site of struggle, a theological battle, a battle for the truth of the gospel.
I had a faith problem, and my faith problem is that we're required to love God with our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and our neighbor as ourselves. But I couldn't be a neighbor to a black person. I was locked into this oppressed-oppressor relationship. But my faith problem took the form of a political system which itself claimed to be Christian, claimed divine guidance for what it did. So like generations of black people before me, I realized to solve my faith problem, I would need to act politically. The perversion of the Christian faith was the principal ideological weapon. So black people were encouraged to be docile, not to worry that they're oppressed now because there is a future heaven waiting.
Apartheid was a cancer that affected everyone in the country.
Not only the oppressed were a prisoner, but as much the oppressor also needed liberation. I always remember a survey published in South Africa in around 1975-76. So the dominant feelings of white people in South Africa: guilt, fear, and anxiety. And that's not how you spell liberation. So I think that helped me to see that freedom had to be for all South Africans, or it would be for nobody.
Father Michael's deep faith pushed him to join the movement for liberation and democracy. Soon he found himself associating with members of the African National Congress.
The policies of the African National Congress of South Africa are extremely attractive to me as an individual, but also as a Christian, because it talked of a non-racial South Africa.
The African National Congress of South Africa, or ANC, was founded in 1912.
If you see the ANC emerging in 1912, in some ways a fairly mild organization, and writing letters, writing petitions. And as the years pass, you get more and more active involvement. Until by the 1950s, you have a campaign for the defiance of unjust laws.
The ANC on the African continent is the mother of all liberation movements. It brought together leaders of not just South Africa, but also Southern Africa.
After that there was a decision made to begin an armed struggle. And even that began in the most disciplined way possible, where the first armed attacks didn't involve taking of human life at all, involved sabotage of economic installations. But as the century proceeds, so the struggle becomes more intense, so it becomes more bitter, and thresholds begin to be crossed.
In 1976, Father Michael was elected by students from all races within the Anglican Church to be a national chaplain.
Young people, and especially students, would be detained, very frequently tortured, and sometimes even disappear into police stations, dying, never to exit alive. And so I was speaking out more and more about these injustices that were happening.
On June 16, 1976, the police shot at school children protesting inferior education for black children and against the imposition of Afrikaans as a language of instruction. The language, Afrikaans, was spoken mainly by white South Africans. At the end of the year, over 1,000 children were killed.
And that shook my faith to its roots. For me, the realization that those who shot children read the Bible every day, went to church on Sunday, and shot kids was extremely traumatic. And I had been, up until that time, a totally convinced pacifist. I preached this pacifism. And it was not long before I discovered that the apartheid state was extremely happy for me to say to black people, you should never use weapons to achieve your rights. In my consistency, I also said to young whites, you shouldn't go and take up arms to prevent your fellow citizens from achieving their rights. That conversation was an illegal conversation. And it was my reflection upon that experience that very reluctantly brought me to the conclusion that in the context of South Africa, and in the context of the history of non-violent struggle against a more and more violent state, that yes, it was true that if people did have a right to defend themselves, and to ask black people not to defend themselves was to actually ask them to be complicitous in their own death. So in a way, my own choice and decision to join the liberation movement, the struggle to free South Africa, was a struggle to recover my own humanity in solidarity with black people who are struggling for their freedom.
Father Michael's visa came up for renewal. Knowing his association to the liberation movement, the government denied an extension of his visa. By the end of September 1976, he was expelled from South Africa. Father Michael and his religious community decided that he should go to Lesotho, a small, landlocked country completely surrounded by the Republic of South Africa.
I said to the African National Congress of South Africa, the illegitimate government of South Africa has expelled me. You are the legitimate representatives, morally legitimate representatives of the people of South Africa. So I'm asking to become a member of the ANC.
Father Michael lived in Lesotho from September 1976 to early 1983.
For several years, I was responsible for training young Anglican ordinand seminarians for the priesthood, and I also, for a time, chaired the only above-ground unit of the African National Congress, the ANC.
And he was representing the ANC youth. And we had this huge blow-up of a debate. I said, how can you as a white man be representing the ANC youth? And he said, but the ANC is a non-racial organization. Accepts black people, white people, everybody else is a member of the ANC. It's a parliament of the people of South Africa. But that was the beginning of a friendship and a discussion about non-racialism. Not in the abstract, but in the practical.
In 1982, 42 people were killed in a massacre. The argument was made that this massacre was directed at Father Michael, and so he was forced to leave Lesotho. However, he would later learn that the church authorities and his own religious community had conspired together to have him expelled. Some members of his religious community said that he was a terrorist. Fortunately for him, history would be on his side, as much later he was made the first head of a new province of his religious community. Later that year, his community sent him to pursue his master's degree at the University of Zimbabwe.
We met in Zimbabwe in the 90s when he was there doing refugee work with the ANC exiles. He was so much one with those young South Africans who had to leave their country, who had to flee.
The Zimbabwean authorities came to me and said, we have information that you're on a South African government hit list. From that day, I was required to live with armed police guards 24 hours a day.
The struggle for liberation was growing exponentially both in South Africa and in the world. Apartheid became an issue of the human family. Consequently, the pressure of the apartheid state became so great that they agreed to talk. As a result of that pressure, Nelson Mandela was released on February 11th, 1990.
Good evening. For 27 years, 6 months and 6 days, he had been a prisoner. During that time, he became a legend, a symbol of black resistance to apartheid, and to many, he became a martyr. Tonight, he is a free man. We start with the CBC's Jean-Francois Lepine.
Mr. Nelson Mandela, the free man, taking his first steps into a new South Africa.
Your tireless and heroic sacrifices have made it possible for me to be here today.
In June 1990, Father Michael accepted a position in a large parish in Bulawayo, the second largest city in Zimbabwe.
I had a farewell party with friends, and I came back to my house with one of the people, a young man I stayed with at the time, and we were sitting chatting. He was on the other side of the room, and I was talking, making phone calls, opening, and at this point began to open the manila envelopes that had been stacked up. So I opened the magazine in English.
I had this explosion. It was very loud. There was dust all over, and I could hear that he was groaning in pain. He was crying for help, but I was afraid because I thought there was another bomb.
The act of opening it was the detonating device for a bomb.
We were cleaning up and relaxing after the party when there was a tremendous banging on the front gate, and a young man, Andrew Matizwa, who lived with Michael, started yelling at us that Michael was hurt and we should come, and we weren't sure what was the trouble. He seemed to be almost as if he was in the throes of a nervous breakdown.
What I remember is being thrown back. It's a moment that went on forever, this being thrown back and back and back, going into darkness, experiencing extraordinary pain.
I was due to have a meeting with him, and I was late. He was phoning me. The phone rang. As I picked it up, he just went dead. And I had a loud explosion.
We went back to Michael's house, which is about 10 blocks from here. When we got there, of course, we found this enormous mess all over the front yard, the windows blowing out, the ceilings blowing out, and Michael lying on the floor of the house, holding his hands up in a kind of, but they were just bleeding stumps. His face was covered in blood, and he was still conscious and alternately sort of praying and calling for painkillers, and took him first to a clinic where he was given basic first aid, and then transferred to the hospital.
I stayed with two young Zimbabwean teachers, and one of them was present, and my biggest fear was that he had either been more seriously injured or that he may have been even killed.
I went into the hospital, and it was just too awful for words, because at that stage we didn't know if Mike could see. At that stage he couldn't see. We didn't know if he would regain his hearing, because he was totally deaf from the blast. Obviously he was badly burnt, and his hands were badly burnt, and he was in absolute agony.
Then they managed to find a doctor from Oregon, Dr. Glenn Gordon.
He was very badly injured. His opening this bomb, it was in his hands, and so both hands were completely damaged, destroyed. He ended up with maybe a bit of function on his right hand, but very little. His left eye was fortunately not damaged too much, but his right eye was almost completely blown away. He had numerous lacerations and injuries around his face. He had both eardrums burst from the blast, so he was a very severely injured person.
Michael, sitting in the back seat of the car, holding his hands up something like this, I guess, to try and stop the bleeding, and then he said it was a book. It came from South Africa.
The extraordinary thing about the bombing is that I remember it. I did not lose consciousness. I did not go into shock.
Father Michael spent a month in a military ward with an armed guard.
There were moments of feeling sorry for myself and thinking perhaps it would be better to be dead. I didn't have any role models. I actually knew another priest who had a letter bomb, and he lost a hand, but he did everything with the other hand. So somehow losing two hands was not twice as bad, but 200 times as bad. In many ways, I was surrounded by prayer, love, and support. So I've often said the only automatic weapon I'd ever use was my tongue. So here I had no hands, but the weapon was working perfectly well. So I think that even that night there was some sense of victory, that in a way I'd won by being alive.
What he said to me was, he said, the Boers made a big mistake. He said, they took away my hands and my eye, but I still have my tongue, and I can continue to denounce apartheid.
I think also I was taken back to a simplicity of faith learnt in earliest childhood, of kind of direct confidence in God. But also, I had gone to a monastery when I was 17, so I had also been shaped and soaked in the Psalms, and it was like people for the previous 4,000 years. I turned to them in many ways for consolation and for support. By receiving a bomb, I'd become an object of evil. I think it's an evil act. But in the response of people around the world, I became an object of all that is beautiful in the human family. Our ability to be tender, loving, kind, generous, compassionate.
Eventually, Father Michael went to Australia for treatment. He had his religious community and his sister there. They supported him while he recuperated.
I think in a way the liberation struggle had prepared me for the possibility of dying. People I knew who had been assassinated, had been blown up, people I'd known and loved. So that had prepared me for the possibility of death. I don't think anything had ever really prepared me for the possibility of permanent, major, physical disability.
In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Life-Giver. Amen. God grant me the serenity.
God grant me the serenity.
To accept the things I cannot change.
To accept the things I cannot change.
Courage to change the things I can.
Courage to change the things I can.
And wisdom to know the difference.
And wisdom to know the difference.
Amen.
Amen.
In the bomb, I lost a lot. I still have a lot, and I've gained. I'm immeasurably richer for the journey that I've traveled. And I would say also my life is not full of regrets. Of course, part of me says, if only I'd seen it was a bomb and hadn't opened it.
When you think, I mean, that he's not able to see out of one eye, that his hearing is now impaired, and of course, I mean, those claws. And you really are expecting something ghoulish to come out, and then to hear all that gentleness, all that compassion, is something that sort of hits you between the eyes.
You know, often people who physically survive horrible things, of course they're survivors, but they remain prisoners of moments in history. And I think there's another step, and it's a step from moving away from being an object of history, someone to whom something has been done, to becoming a subject of history once more, to become a participant in helping shape and create the world. Because I also realized that if I was filled with hatred, bitterness, self-pity, desire for revenge, they would have failed to kill the body, but they would have killed the soul.
After spending several months in the hospital, Father Michael decided to return to South Africa. In Australia, he was advised not to return. He flew to Zimbabwe, where he again was advised the same. But he was determined to go and rejoin the struggle for liberation for his people. And so in 1992, he returned to South Africa.
And it was apparent by then that what had happened to me in terms of a deadly attack was just a straw in the wind of an unleashing by the apartheid state of an extremely violent form of destabilization. We lost thousands of lives during the period of negotiations.
A year after he returned to South Africa, Father Michael was one of the first employees of a trauma center for survivors of violence and torture.
The first thing that struck me was that we were a damaged nation. We were damaged in our humanity. We were damaged by what we'd done. We were damaged by what had been done to us. We were damaged by what we failed to do. Those democratic elections were the fulfillment of a dream. We had struggled and fought for the right of every South African to be able to participate fully as equal citizens in the political life of the country. So it was for me a deeply spiritual moment.
I, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, do hereby swear to be faithful to the Republic of South Africa. So help me God.
And so when the first democratic elections took place and Nelson Mandela became the president, it was a triumph not just for South Africans, but it was a triumph for people of goodwill everywhere, a triumph over racism, over injustice, over oppression. And it gave hope to millions of people in their own struggles throughout the world, that one day they too could triumph.
But there was still work to be done.
How would we deal with the economic, physical legacy of apartheid in terms of houses and jobs and shelter and health care and all the basic human things that we need as human beings? But the other question was, how would we deal with the past? How would we deal with what we had done to one another?
During the period leading up to the democratic election, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, headed by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, was formed. It was an earth-shattering process wherein the victim and the perpetrator sat in the same hall telling their stories and asking for forgiveness. Many of the perpetrators received amnesty. But Father Michael and many leaders realized a deeper healing was essential for a country to break through the pain of the past and move on.
The thesis was that we were all damaged. We were not all pathological. We were not all in need of long-term expert psychiatric or psychological treatment. But we all had a story to tell. We all had stuff inside of us, whether we were the perpetrators, the victims, the bystanders, or, as often the case, some kind of combination of all three. And that we couldn't create a very nice nation if we didn't deal with what was in us.
And to deal with these painful memories, Father Michael founded the Institute of Healing of Memories. This institute seeks to accompany individuals, communities, and nations on their journey to healing and wholeness. They do this through a workshop.
Healing of Memories workshops provide a safe and sacred space where individuals in a collective way can explore how the past of our country has affected them psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. It's an experiential workshop that takes place over 2.5 days with up to 25 people at a time. The method we use is experiential throughout. So, for example, on the first night, we use a community theatre group that does a small dramatic piece about South Africa's past.
The short play is used as an emotional trigger to help people get in touch with their own memories and feelings of the past.
I cried. I remember when the lady played the crying mother. I cried. I cried for all the pain of the apartheid that affected my life.
We lay ground rules and give people a set of questions that focus on how the past of the nation has affected people, what has been their most painful and most wonderful experiences of their life, how have they survived, where do they get the resources to survive, what's been their faith journey, and 3 underlying questions. We ask people to reflect on that overnight. On the second day, we invite people to draw their life story in the light of the questions they have reflected upon. And then we use those pictures as a way in to a deep sharing of life stories in a small group context. On the third day, we begin to move away from a focus on the past towards looking to the future. And the way we do that is give people clay and ask them to create a symbol of peace.
A symbol of peace and hope is a hand and uncurled fingers, which at one time was a clenched fist.
Life is kind of for the children who have been abused.
Another key element of the workshop is its culmination in the creation of a liturgy or a kind of creative service or celebration. And that is based upon the realization that all cultures have rites of passage where we enact things symbolically, where people are able to celebrate the journey they've traveled, but also recognize that they have moved further in their journey. Now we're going to light the fire, and into the fire we're going to put the pieces of paper in which we've put that which is destructive in us, that we want to leave behind at this workshop, so we can travel forward with our burdens being lighter.
The Institute of the Healing of Memories has taken this process to various violence-stricken countries like Namibia, Burundi, Zimbabwe, Rwanda, Lesotho, Zambia, Malawi, Uganda, Eritrea, Northern Ireland, East Timor, and even the United States, Australia, and Germany.
I always remember the framing by the Germans of the first workshop that took place in Hamburg, where they called it Dealing with the Burden of History. And there are parallels between South Africa and the German people.
From October 30th to November 2nd of 2009, the Healing of Memories workshop was held in White Plains, New York. There were 20 participants and 6 facilitators.
People had come not only from New York State. Father Romain had come from Boston, who was a Rwandese priest who had had huge family losses in the genocide in Rwanda. We had a couple who were victims and survivors of the Greensboro killings of nearly 30 years ago. 2 people who came from Hawaii. Steve Karakashian had come from Oregon, and Sitar, an Iraqi. And I think his participation created a dimension that would not have otherwise been there. Of course, 2 of us, my daughter and myself, had come from South Africa. Another connection was the presence of Phyllis, who's a member of the 9/11 Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, those families who said, you may not go to war in the name of our relatives who died on September the 11th.
On May 1st, 2010, a Thanksgiving Mass was held at the cathedral in Cape Town to commemorate Father Michael's survival from the brutal attack 20 years ago. Archbishop Desmond Tutu was the main celebrant.
But I think through prayer, love, support, I'd say God has enabled me to make my bombing redemptive. And by that I mean to bring the good out of the evil, the life out of the dead. We are going to take the route of seeking to remember and to heal rather than to bury and to forget. And if poisonous memories are kept inside human beings, eventually they infect the whole system, as our whole system as human beings, physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, and can even kill us. And that is also true of nations.
When all the symbols are together, I love watching it. I love watching it and see that flame of hope. That's the one thing. And I know we are getting somewhere. We are going.
From that on, I feel, frankly, I'm very relieved from the pain.
This work, by its character, is costly, it's painful, it's emotionally draining, but immensely rewarding as well, because we work with human beings at the deepest level.
You come to this country and you're confronted with so much pain and drama and violence and death, and all of a sudden there's a sense like this can work and can be very beautiful. So I remember I was singing all the way home. Really good space. It was a very good space. Bye-bye.
In the Healing of Memories work, I'm seeking with others to return the compliment of what was done with me and for me, to give others the opportunity for their story to be acknowledged and reverenced and recognized, because I know that's what enabled me to walk a journey from victimhood through being a survivor to becoming a victor. And I believe that that is God's will for individuals, communities, and nations.